So in this question, it's asking you how useful is source C, which is above, to an historian studying the impact on the indigenous peoples of the British colonisation of America. So what is that asking you? It's saying, really, how did the British affect the Native Americans? Okay, and what's this source telling you about that effect? And with a how useful question, the first thing you need to do is you need to look at the source itself and say, well, what is it telling me about the impact of the British? So what can I see here? I'm always going to do both bits at first, read both bits, because it's always useful to do that. So it says a 17th century drawing of Captain John Smith's encounter with the native people in Virginia. Smith was a well-known early British settler who became internationally famous when Disney animated the story of Pocahontas. The drawing appeared in a book published in 1624 by Captain Smith called The General History of Virginia, New England and the Summer Isles. And in this picture, what can I see? Well, hopefully it should be fairly clear that you can see some Native Americans here, and they're armed with bows and arrows there. And then here he is, Captain Smith. There he's twice. He's in these pictures twice. And in this first one, it says, well, this is how he was taken prisoner by those Native Americans. And then here he is fighting with the Native American tribes. Okay? So what is it telling me about the impact of the British? Well, for me, it's telling me that there were serious disagreements between the settlers and the Native Americans, which led so far as to all-out war and violence. So it's showing me there was violence and significant disagreements, which actually led to, ultimately, death, doesn't it? I mean, you can see he's actually killing some of them. Okay, so this is a pretty serious problem between the two. Now, the second thing is I want you to think about, when you've got a how useful question, I want you to think about the provenance. Okay, and when we think about the provenance, we're thinking about questions like, when was it made? Well, it was made in the 17th century, 1624, so it's the right time, so it's useful in that respect for finding out what people thought at the time. Who made it? Well, it's made by Captain Smith. It's made by Captain Smith about Captain Smith. So if it's made by him, for him, it's going to be a very subjective view, isn't it? It's a one-sided view, okay? And finally, the provenance. Well, why is he making it? Well, if he's making a book about his own experiences, and he's publishing it in England, well, his audience is probably likely to be, British people, isn't it, or British colonists. And it's probably going to put him in a good light, isn't it? Because he's going to want to show, his own experiences. So it's really going to be quite a partial view of this impact. It's going to show what he wants to show. And if I look at this and sort of connect it to it, I'm thinking the tone. I think he's trying to show himself to be a sort of brave type chap, a bit of a hero, I think. But there he is, because part of the reason I can tell that is because he's on his own. He's fighting against, there's loads of them, and there's only one of him. And there he is battling away. And my feeling is he's probably saying that because he's sort of wanting to put himself to suggest that there he is out in the new world, fighting for Britain, fighting for the British interests. It's very exciting what he's doing, and that's the kind of general tone. Now, so it's useful in the sense that it's useful in that this gives us a good idea of what British colonists believed their purpose was in the New World. Their purpose was to go out there to fight the Indians if necessary, take their land and establish it for Britain. Now, what evidence do I know that would explain that would say that's true? And what I know about the 17th century is it is indeed true that they did end up fighting the Native Americans. And how do we know that's true? Well, it's because they wanted their land, and there was disputes over land, particularly as more and more settlers arrived. So we know that what began as a reasonable relationship soon became very difficult because they were fighting over land. And we also know that actually led to massacres on both sides. And of course we also know that another big problem was illness in terms of the impact. So this really it is quite useful in the fact that it's overall, if I'm thinking of number 4 here, what's my overall? Well, I think it's useful because it shows us the attitude, doesn't it, of the British to the Native Americans. For me, it tells me that actually the British thought it was perfectly acceptable. He's not shying away from the fact that he's killing these Native Americans. And I think it's showing that, this is useful because it tells us that the British were prepared to use violence where necessary to establish these colonies. So those are the things I would be thinking about in a how useful question. And you see what I've done there? I've focused on what is useful. To a historian, this source tells us quite a lot about the fact that British people went out to America to establish colonies, and they were prepared to use violence in order to do it, and they weren't ashamed of it. In fact, if anything, he seems rather proud of his actions. Okay, and that's the focus for me in that question.